The scream that tore through Shaft 7 wasn't human. Thomas Blackwell knew this, because he'd heard men die before, crushed under rockfalls, suffocated by bad air, burned by methane explosions, and their final sounds always carried that desperate clinging to life, that animal refusal to let go. This sound was different. This was acceptance. Isaiah Carter stood frozen 20 feet ahead, his headlamp painting the cavern wall in harsh white light, and in that light, Thomas saw what had reduced a decorated marine to absolute silence. Fingers. Dozens of them. Hundreds. Protruding from the cave wall like obscene stalactites, each one grey as tombstone granite, each one bent at impossible angles, each one still moving, still reaching, still grasping at air that hadn't been breathable for over a century. The smell hit him next. Copper and earth and something else, something that smelled like his grandmother's root cellar mixed with burnt hair. Then Isaiah's headlamp died, just winked out, followed by the lamps of Rosa and Yuki behind Thomas, one by one, like candles in a church, until only old Sam's light remained, and in that single wavering beam, Thomas saw the thing that had been watching them since they breached the collapsed section of the mine. It was small, child-sized, with eyes that reflected their remaining light like an animal's, like a predator's, but ancient beyond measure, old enough to remember when these Kentucky hills had different names in different languages. Its skin was the color of wet slate, its joints bent backwards, and when it smiled, oh God, when it smiled, Thomas understood why the 17 miners who'd found this chamber in 1874 had emerged 3 days later, unable to speak, unable to write, unable to do anything but draw the same symbol over and over until their hands cramped and their minds shattered completely. The creature stepped forward. The reaching fingers withdrew into the stone. And Thomas Blackwell's last coherent thought before the darkness swallowed him whole was, "We were never supposed to dig this deep." If you connect with my story, please press the like button to find some light in this priest's heart. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next life stories, and tell me about them in the comments where you are watching this video and what time it is right now. It makes me very happy to know that from any corner of the country or the world you are listening to me. They called him Grimshaw, though he had no memory of ever being named. The designation had been carved into the cavern wall in 1847 by a surveyor who'd glimpsed him in the torchlight and lived just long enough to scratch those 8 letters into limestone before his heart gave out from pure terror. Grimshaw. It meant grey forest in some ancient dialect, and perhaps it was fitting for a creature who dwelt in the stone darkness beneath the Daniel Boone National Forest for longer than Kentucky had been Kentucky, longer than America had been America, longer than the Cherokee and Shawnee had walked these hills speaking their own names for the deep places that men should not disturb. Grimshaw was old, so old that he remembered when the caverns had been his alone, when the only sounds were dripping water and shifting rock, and his own breathing echoing off walls that had never known light. He remembered solitude. He remembered peace. He remembered the exact moment that had shattered forever, April 19th, 1874, when 17 miners broke through the collapsed eastern tunnel and flooded his sanctuary with lamp oil and gunpowder stink and the horrible invasive sound of human voices. What Grimshaw had done to those men still lingered in the stone. Their silence had become part of the cave's architecture, woven into the mineral deposits like fossils, and he could feel them even now. 17 minds locked in eternal wordlessness, 17 souls that had touched something they couldn't process and simply stopped. The guilt was a physical weight Grimshaw carried in his chest, heavier than the mountain above him. Grimshaw hadn't always been a monster. Once, in a time so distant it felt like someone else's memory, he'd been something different, something that walked upright and spoke in tongues now extinct and worshipped gods whose names had eroded like sandstone. The transformation had been gradual, a punishment that took centuries to complete, each year in the darkness changing him a little more, bending his spine, elongating his fingers, turning his eyes into reflective pools that could navigate absolute blackness. He'd been a guardian once, placed here by people who understood that some places held power that needed watching, that certain veins of crystal and mineral ran deeper than geology could explain, touching something vast and patient and utterly inhuman far below. His crime had been simple. He'd abandoned his post. left the deep places unguarded for a single night to attend his daughter's wedding in a village that had crumbled to dust before Columbus sailed. When he'd returned at dawn, the damage was done. Something had stirred in the lowest chambers, something that had been sleeping since the world was young, and though Grimshaw had managed to seal it away again, the cost was everything. His people exiled him, bound him to the caves with words that still echoed in languages no living human spoke, and cursed him to become what he guarded against, a thing of the deep, a creature of stone and darkness, immortal and alone. The 1874 incident had been an accident. Grimshaw had meant only to frighten the miners away, to protect them from what lay deeper in the system, but he'd underestimated the fragility of human minds when confronted with true otherness. He'd shown them too much too quickly, glimpses of the vast network of caves that extended miles below the mapped tunnels, visions of the things that dwelt in those depths, echoes of the ancient binding that kept the sleeping power contained. The miners' minds had simply shut down, self-preservation overwhelming rational thought, leaving them hollow and mute. Grimshaw had watched them stumble back to the surface, watched the town of Harlan try to understand what had happened, watched the mine close and the tunnel collapse and the story become legend. He'd promised himself never again. For 149 years he'd kept that promise, scaring away the occasional explorer with subtle tricks, phantom sounds, inexplicable cold spots, tools mysteriously relocated, never revealing himself, never doing permanent harm. But now they were back, modern miners with modern equipment, drilling and blasting their way toward his domain with scientific precision and corporate disregard for the old warnings. Grimshaw had felt them coming for weeks, vibrations through the rock announcing their approach like a slow-motion earthquake. He'd tried his usual methods, collapsed a few minor tunnels, created gas pockets that forced evacuations, even manifested as shadows that made workers quit in droves. Nothing worked. They kept coming. And now they'd breached Shaft 7, the one passage that led directly to his sanctum, to the place where the ancient binding was carved into living stone, to the threshold he'd guarded for 9 centuries. Thomas Blackwell had been expecting trouble. Helios Mining's acquisition of the abandoned Harlan County coal rights had been contentious from the start. Local historians and Cherokee representatives protesting the disturbance of what they called sacred ground, though Thomas figured that was just the polite way of saying haunted as hell. He'd read the reports from 1874, studied the testimonies of the 17 silent miners who'd been institutionalized until their deaths, examined the curious fact that every single one of them had died on the same date, April 19, 1897, exactly 23 years after their trauma, all from unexplained cardiac arrest, all with their eyes open and their mouths frozen in shapes that looked like screaming but produced no sound. Creepy as hell, sure, but Thomas had worked Appalachian mines for 24 years, and every single one had ghost stories. Flooded shafts where drowned miners supposedly walked, collapsed seams where you could hear phantom picks and shovels, elevator cages that operated themselves at midnight, superstition and methane hallucinations, nothing more. The company psychologist had warned him about suggestibility, about how isolated workers in confined spaces could develop shared delusions, about the importance of maintaining rational thinking. Thomas had assured her his crew was solid. Isaiah Carter, 28, former Marine with 2 combat deployments, nerves of steel. Yuki Tanaka, 35, geological engineer from MIT who approached everything with scientific skepticism. Rosa Martinez, 24, fresh from Colorado School of Mines, brilliant and ambitious. And old Sam Morrison, 67, a 4th-generation Appalachian miner who claimed he'd seen it all and feared nothing but his ex-wife and the Lord Almighty, in that order. They were professionals. They would extract the rare earth minerals from the lower seams, document their findings and move on. Simple. Except nothing about Shaft 7 was simple. The first anomaly appeared 3 days into the excavation. Yuki discovered it while analyzing core samples, a seam of crystalline material that didn't match anything in her reference database, refracting light in ways that violated basic optical principles and inexplicably warm to the touch despite being extracted from 3,000 feet underground. When she sent a fragment to the surface lab, it disappeared in transit. Just vanished from a locked sample case, between the elevator and the geology trailer. The second anomaly was the silence. Isaiah noticed it first. His military training attuned to environmental changes, the usual sounds of a deep mine, dripping water, settling rock, the hum of ventilation systems gradually faded until they worked in acoustic deadness so complete it was disorienting. When Isaiah dropped his wrench to test the effect, it hit the stone floor without making a sound, like the air itself had become cotton. The third anomaly was old Sam's behavior. The veteran miner had grown increasingly agitated, muttering about the old warnings, insisting they were digging where the mountain doesn't want disturbance, refusing to work the night shifts. Thomas dismissed it as elderly anxiety until he found Sam's notebook, filled with sketches of a symbol he'd never seen. A spiral within a spiral within a spiral, descending endlessly, with what looked like reaching hands around the perimeter. When Thomas asked about it, Sam claimed he didn't remember drawing anything, said his hands just moved on their own sometimes, said Thomas should seal it up and walk away while you can still talk about it afterward. Thomas didn't walk away. Helios was paying triple overtime for this extraction. His daughter's college fund depended on this contract. So he ignored the warnings, ignored the anomalies, ignored the growing certainty in his gut that they were trespassing on something that had been deliberately buried and deliberately forgotten. Grimshaw watched them work with something approaching admiration. The woman, Yuki, understood the crystal formations better than anyone in a century, recognizing them as something beyond natural geology, even if she couldn't explain how or why. The young man, Isaiah, moved with the awareness of a warrior, checking corners, trusting his instincts, never fully relaxing even in supposed safety. The girl, Rosa, approached the cave system with genuine reverence, treating the stone like a living thing, which it was, in ways she couldn't begin to comprehend. The old man, Sam, remembered. Not consciously, but his bloodline remembered. Grimshaw could see it in his eyes, could trace the genetic echo back 4 generations to Samuel Morrison Sr. One of the 17 who'd gone silent in 1874, who'd passed on something in his corrupted DNA, some cellular memory of absolute terror that his descendant now carried like an inheritance. And the leader, Thomas, was simply a man trying to provide for his family, unaware that his pragmatism was leading 5 people toward a threshold that should never be crossed. Grimshaw had tried to warn them, tried to make them leave through gentle persuasion, the vanished samples, the impossible silence, the compulsive drawings that should have triggered alarm. But humans were stubborn creatures, their fear of economic failure often outweighing their fear of the unknown. So Grimshaw had escalated, manifested the reaching fingers, imprints of the 17, their last conscious gestures preserved in mineral form, hands forever stretching toward a salvation that never came. Killed their lights to disorient them, showed himself in the darkness, let them see what 900 years of isolation and transformation had created. The moment Thomas saw Grimshaw clearly, really saw him in old Sam's wavering headlamp, something broke in his mind and something else clicked into place. This wasn't a story, this wasn't superstition. This was real. Standing maybe 4 feet tall, with limbs that bent at angles that defied skeletal possibility, skin that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, except for those eyes, those ancient, sorrowful, infinitely tired eyes that held an intelligence so vast and so lonely, it made Thomas want to weep. The creature wasn't attacking, it was pleading. Thomas could see it in every line of that impossible body, in the way those backwards jointed hands reached toward them, not in threat but in desperation, in the way its mouth opened and sounds emerged. Not words, not exactly, but something older than words, something that bypassed language and spoke directly to the primitive hindbrain that remembered when humans huddled in caves and feared the dark for good reason. Don't go deeper. Those sounds meant. Don't break the seal. Don't wake what sleeps. Isaiah raised his rock hammer, defensive instinct overriding rational thought, but Rosa grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "Wait," she whispered, and her voice cracked the silence like breaking glass, startling them all. "Look at the walls." They looked. Every surface of the chamber was covered in carvings, thousands of them, spiraling upward and downward in patterns that hurt to follow, symbols from dozens of languages, some recognizable like Cherokee syllabary and colonial English, others completely alien, all saying the same thing in different voices across different centuries, sealed by covenant, guarded by the bound one, disturb not the deep places. Aoki's scientific mind tried to process what her eyes were reporting, and failed spectacularly. This chamber shouldn't exist according to the geological surveys. This creature couldn't exist according to any biological taxonomy. These carvings represented cultures separated by millennia, yet they were carved with identical precision into identical depth, as if the same hand had worked across centuries. "Impossible," she heard herself say, and the creature, Grimshaw, God help her, she knew his name without knowing how she knew, tilted his head with something that looked like sympathy. He gestured to the far wall, where a section of stone stood apart from the rest, smoother, darker, radiating a cold that made frost patterns bloom on their equipment, despite the ambient temperature being a constant 58 degrees. Grimshaw touched that wall with one elongated finger, and the stone began to glow, faint phosphorescence revealing what lay beneath. A door. Not metaphorical. An actual constructed doorway, sealed with more symbols, more warnings, more desperate pleas from the past to the future. And beyond that door they could all feel it now, something immense and patient and completely wrong, something that made their teeth ache and their hearts stutter and their minds recoil from even peripheral awareness. "What is it?" Thomas asked, not expecting an answer from a creature that hadn't spoken human language in 900 years. But Grimshaw surprised him. The creature's throat worked, vocal cords unused for centuries, creaking like rusty hinges, and 3 words emerged in a voice like grinding stone. "The first hunger." Old Sam collapsed, just sat down hard, hand over his heart, face gone grey. "My great-great-grandfather," he gasped. "He drew that door, over and over, in his asylum cell, until he died." Grimshaw nodded slowly, acknowledging, accepting responsibility. The story spilled out of Grimshaw in fits and starts, his voice growing stronger as ancient neural pathways remembered how to shape words, how to communicate in something other than fear and warning. He told them about the binding ceremony performed when the world was young, when his people, whose name translated roughly as "those who watch the cracks," first discovered that certain places on Earth weren't entirely part of Earth, that reality had weak points where things from outside could press through, where the vast and hungry things that existed in the spaces between spaces could taste our dimension like wolves scenting prey. The cavern system beneath Kentucky was one such weak point, maybe the largest in North America, a place where the membrane between worlds had worn thin through some ancient cosmic accident or design. Something had tried to push through once, millions of years ago, and though it failed, it left behind a residue, an infection, a presence that had been slowly, infinitely slowly, trying to complete the breach. Grimshaw's people built the seals, 7 layers of them, each one a miracle of lost engineering, mathematics, and metaphysics, each one requiring a guardian to maintain and renew and defend. Grimshaw had been the last guardian. His people had died out, scattered, been absorbed into other tribes, other nations, but the duty remained. The curse that bound him to the caves and transformed his body was also the power source for the deepest seal, the final lock keeping the first hunger contained. If that seal broke, if the door opened, if the hunger tasted fresh reality after aeons of starvation, Grimshaw didn't have words for what would happen because language couldn't contain it. But he showed them, touched each person's forehead with one cold finger, and let them see, really see, what the end of the world looked like, through eyes that had witnessed it in prophetic dreams for 9 centuries. Thomas vomited, couldn't help it. The vision Grimshaw shared was too much, too vast, too absolutely antithetical to human existence. He saw reality unraveling like a pulled thread, saw the first hunger pour through the broken seal like water through a cracked dam, saw it spread across the surface world, consuming not just matter, but meaning, turning forests and cities and people into geometric impossibilities, into spaces that existed in too many dimensions simultaneously, into screaming fractals of flesh and stone, and thought all melted together and still somehow conscious, still somehow aware of what they'd become. He saw Kentucky become a wound in the world, saw the infection spread state by state, country by country, until the planet itself was just another feeding ground for something that had been hungry since before stars learned to burn. When the vision released him, Thomas was on his knees. Rosa was crying silently. Yuki had her hands over her mouth. Isaiah was shaking with barely contained panic. And old Sam was praying in a language Thomas didn't recognize but suspected was Cherokee, words his ancestor must have taught him in dreams the same way Grimshaw had just taught them all the meaning of true horror. "Why show us?" Rosa managed to ask. "Why not just kill us?" Grimshaw's expression might have been a smile or a grimace. "Because killing solves nothing," he said in that grinding stone voice. "The seals weaken, always have, every century a little more. I renew them, but I am one and they are seven, and I am so tired of this eternal watch. In 1874, I thought. I hoped." He trailed off, looking at the wall of reaching hands. "I hoped they would understand and help. Instead, I broke them, made them silent, added to the horror instead of preventing it." He turned those ancient eyes on Thomas. "You have brought tools, knowledge, understanding I do not possess. Perhaps together we can do what I alone cannot, strengthen the seals permanently. Or," he gestured to the chamber entrance, "you can leave, seal the shaft. Tell your company the mine is unstable. Walk away, resume your lives. The seals will hold for perhaps another decade before the first hunger finds purchase. You will die before it breaks free. Your children might die before it breaks free. Ignorance is a mercy I can offer." The decision should have been simple. Walk away, protect his crew, let someone else deal with incomprehensible cosmic horror in a decade or a century or whenever. Thomas opened his mouth to give the order to retreat and found himself saying instead, "What do you need us to do?" Isaiah's head snapped toward him in disbelief, but before anyone could protest, Grimshaw's face did something complex. Relief and sorrow and desperate hope all flickering across inhuman features. "The seventh seal," he said, moving toward the glowing door. "The deepest and strongest. It requires renewal through sacrifice, not death," he added quickly, seeing their expressions, "but something freely given. My people used years of their lives, willingly offered, woven into the binding. I have given 900 years, but I have no more to spare. The magic requires multiplicity, 7 contributors, 7 offerings." He looked at each of them in turn. "I am one. I need 6 more." The silence that followed was profound. Then old Sam stood up on shaky legs and said, "My great-great-grandfather went mad because of this place, died silent because of what happened here. Maybe it's time a Morrison actually helped instead of just being another victim." He stepped forward. "How many years you need?" Rosa was next, surprising everyone, including herself. "I became an engineer to build things that last," she said. "What lasts longer than saving the world?" Yuki approached with scientific precision, already calculating. "If we each contribute equally, assuming Grimshaw's 900 years represents 1/7 of the original binding, we'd each need to offer approximately 128 years, which we obviously don't have, so the math must scale based on something else. Potential lifespan, willing consciousness, emotional weight." Grimshaw nodded. "The latter. The measure is meaning, not duration. Years lived with purpose, way more than centuries of emptiness." Isaiah was the only one who hesitated, and Thomas didn't blame him. The Marine had survived combat through careful risk assessment and tactical thinking. This was neither careful nor tactical. But finally, Isaiah said, "In Helmand Province, I watched my best friend die taking a bullet meant for a kid, 5-year-old girl. She's probably a teenager now, living a life he made possible. He'd understand this. Hell, he'd volunteer first." He stood beside old Sam. They all looked at Thomas. Thomas thought about his daughter, Emily, 14 years old, obsessed with marine biology, determined to save the oceans, full of fierce hope that the world could be better. He thought about his wife, Catherine, who'd supported this dangerous job because they both believed in building a future worth living. He thought about the vision Grimshaw had shown him, Emily's flesh becoming impossible geometry. Catherine's mind shredded across dimensional boundaries, everything he loved unmade and consumed. He thought about walking away, about comfortable ignorance, about letting a decade pass before the horror came. Then he thought about being the kind of father who'd let cosmic horror devour his daughter's future, rather than sacrifice comfort in the present. 7 of us, he said, moving to join the others. Tell us how this works. Grimshaw led them to the sealed door, and as they approached, the symbols carved into its surface began to glow brighter, responding to proximity, to intention, to the possibility of renewal. Place your hands on the stone, Grimshaw instructed. Open your minds. Think of what you hold most dear, what gives your life meaning, what you would preserve at any cost. The binding will measure that weight, that meaning, and take what it needs. It will hurt, he added honestly. Memory will blur. Time will become strange. You may lose pieces of yourselves you didn't know you could spare, but you will live, and you will speak, and you will remember enough to know why you chose this. They placed their hands on the door. The stone was cold, so cold it burned, and the moment they all made contact, the world exploded into light and sensation and time. Grimshaw felt it first, the binding recognizing the pattern, 7 souls offering themselves freely, the magic responding with hungry eagerness it hadn't known in centuries. He poured himself into it, felt 900 years of loneliness and duty and guilt flow out of him and into the stone, felt the weight he'd carried for so long finally being shared. Thomas felt his wedding day dissolve into soft edges, important but distant, felt Emily's birth become a fact rather than a memory, felt years of his life compress and simplify, extracting the emotional weight like juice from fruit and leaving behind pulp that was still nutritious but no longer sweet. Rosa felt her grandmother's stories evaporate, the tales of Mexico and migration and making a life in a new land, felt them become knowledge instead of sensation, felt herself becoming a little less herself and a little more like everyone else, generic memories replacing specific ones, and mourned even as she gave them freely. Yuki felt her mother tongue sliding away, Japanese characters becoming harder to recall, poetry she'd memorized as a child becoming meaningless sounds, her connection to heritage thinning like paper in water, and she held on to her core self while letting the periphery dissolve. Isaiah felt Helmand Province blurring, felt his friend's death becoming statistics instead of trauma, felt the sharp edges of combat PTSD softening into dull acceptance, felt the nightmares that had plagued him for years simply evaporating, and wasn't sure if he should be grateful or horrified. Old Sam felt the most, being oldest, having the most to give. His wife's face aging in reverse, growing younger, and then abstract, and then just someone I loved. His children's names becoming harder to recall, decades of experience compressing into intuition without origin. His entire rich life becoming bullet points instead of chapters. The door's symbols blazed nova bright, and in that light they saw the binding being woven, saw their sacrifices being spun into threads of pure will and knotted into patterns that defied Euclidean geometry, saw those threads sink into the stone and spread throughout the 7th seal, reinforcing it, strengthening it, making it whole in ways it hadn't been since Grimshaw's people first built it when mammoths walked the earth. And on the other side of the door they felt the first hunger recoil, felt it thrash against the renewed barrier with rage and frustration, and a hatred so vast it had its own gravity. But the seal held. The seal held. The seal held. When the light finally faded and they collapsed away from the door, gasping and disoriented, the symbols were dark again, but somehow fuller, somehow satisfied. Grimshaw looked different, still inhuman, still ancient, but lighter somehow, as if 900 years of solitary burden had been replaced by something shared, something communal. "It is done," he said, and his voice was steadier now, more present. "The 7th seal will hold for another 1,000 years, perhaps more. The first hunger is contained." Thomas tried to stand and found his legs wouldn't cooperate. He looked at the others and saw the same confusion, the same sense of waking from a dream they could only half remember. "What did we lose?" he asked. Grimshaw's expression was compassionate. "Pieces. not cause. You will find gaps in your memories, moments that feel distant, connections that seem abstract. But you retain yourselves, you retain your purpose, and you have given the world a gift it will never know to thank you for. He helped Thomas to his feet, those backwards jointed hands surprisingly gentle. Return to the surface. Tell your company the mine is unsafe. The rare earth deposits you sought are inaccessible, too close to unstable seams. They will believe you. They will seal the shaft. The deep places will remain undisturbed. And you? Rosa asked, finding her voice. You're not alone anymore. We helped renew the seal, but you still have to guard it, right? Grimshaw nodded slowly. I am still bound, still cursed, still the last of my people, but he looked at each of them in turn. You have given me something I thought I had lost forever. Hope. Hope that humans can still choose duty over comfort. Hope that when faced with incomprehensible horror, some will still stand their ground. Hope that I am not entirely alone in this watch. He moved to the chamber wall and placed his hand on the stone, and the reaching fingers, the 17 from 1874, began to retract, slowly dissolving back into the mineral, released at last from their frozen anguish. I could not free them before, Grimshaw said softly. The guilt anchored them here as surely as any magic, but now I can let them rest. You have given me that gift as well. Old Sam watched the fingers disappear and felt something in his chest unclench, some inherited trauma finally releasing its grip. Will we forget? He asked. Eventually. Grimshaw shook his head. You will remember enough. The binding required meaning, not memory. What you did here, why you did it, the choice you made, that will remain. The details may blur, the cosmic horror may fade into abstraction, but you will know you stood at the threshold and chose to defend it. That knowledge is yours to keep. Isaiah looked at the sealed door one last time and asked the question they were all thinking. How long until someone else tries to dig this deep? How long until they breach the chamber again? Grimshaw's smile was sad and knowing. Humans are persistent, curious, and driven by needs that override caution. Someone will come, perhaps in 50 years, perhaps in 500. But now I know what to do differently. Show them enough to frighten, but not enough to shatter. Share the burden rather than bear it alone. Trust that some humans, when presented with the truth, will choose to be guardians rather than conquerors. He moved toward the tunnel that led back to Shaft 7. Come, I will guide you to the surface. Your absence will have been noticed. 3 days have passed. 3 days? Yuki checked her watch and found it dead, the digital display blank. We've only been here for hours? Minutes? I don't. Time moves differently near the seals, Grimshaw explained. Your minds processed it as minutes. Your bodies endured days. You will be hungry, thirsty, disoriented. They will assume you were trapped by a collapse, miraculously survived. Let them assume this. It is closer to the truth than they could bear. The journey back to the surface was strange. Grimshaw moved through the darkness with perfect confidence, leading them through passages that didn't appear on any map, around obstacles that shouldn't have been there, always choosing the safest route with knowledge that could only come from 900 years of intimate familiarity. They didn't speak much, partly from exhaustion, partly from the growing sense that words were inadequate to what they'd experienced, partly because they were already beginning to forget the details, the vision of the first hunger becoming abstract, the sensation of the binding becoming dreamlike. When they finally saw daylight filtering down from Shaft 7's upper entrance, it was blinding and beautiful and completely surreal. Grimshaw stopped at the boundary where darkness met light. I cannot go further, he said, but I will watch you emerge. I will ensure no rock falls, no gas pocket ignites, no accident claims you after you have given so much. Thomas turned back to face him fully. This isn't goodbye, he said. We know you're here now. We know what you're protecting. If you need help, if the seals weaken again, if... He trailed off, unsure how to make a promise that spanned centuries. Grimshaw understood. If I need you, I will find a way to call. You and your bloodlines, you have all contributed to the binding. You are all connected to it now, connected to me, connected to this place. Your descendants will feel the pull if the time comes. They may not understand why, but they will know to return." He reached out and touched each person's forehead one final time, a blessing or a marking or simply acknowledgement. "Go. Live your lives. Love your families. Build your futures. Know that every day you experience, every joy and sorrow and mundane moment, exists because you stood in the deep place and chose to be guardians. That is no small thing." The rescue operation was massive. 3 days of searching had convinced the surface team that the 5 missing miners were dead, casualties of a catastrophic collapse in an unstable shaft. When Thomas, Isaiah, Yuki, Rosa, and Old Sam emerged from Shaft 7, dirty, dehydrated, disoriented but alive, it was treated as a miracle. The questions came immediately. What happened? Where were you trapped? How did you survive? And they told a version of the truth. A collapse sealed them in a lower chamber. They rationed their supplies. They worked together to find an alternate route out. The details were fuzzy from stress and oxygen deprivation. Medical exams showed severe dehydration and minor injuries consistent with their story. Psychological evaluations noted some confusion and memory gaps, but nothing inconsistent with trauma. Helios Mining's lawyers wanted detailed reports. The crew gave them. Shaft 7 was geologically unstable, prone to sudden collapses. The rare earth deposits were inaccessible without unacceptable risk to personnel. Corporate accountants ran the numbers and decided Kentucky wasn't worth 5 potential wrongful death lawsuits. The mine was sealed within a week. Thomas Blackwell returned home to his wife and daughter and found his memories of them were still there, but somehow different, still precious, but in a way that felt earned rather than automatic. Emily asked what it was like being trapped underground for 3 days, and he told her it was dark and scary but also illuminating, that sometimes you discover what really matters when you're forced to decide what's worth fighting for. She seemed satisfied with that answer. Catherine noticed he seemed lighter somehow, less burdened by invisible weights, and when she asked if something had changed, he kissed her forehead and said, "I think I finally understand what I'm working for." Isaiah Carter left the mining company and became a park ranger in Daniel Boone National Forest, unable to articulate exactly why, but knowing with absolute certainty that he needed to be near those woods, those hills, those deep places. He never entered caves again, but he guarded their entrances, turned away the reckless explorers, maintained the closure notices on abandoned mine shafts. At night, sometimes, he dreamed of a small figure in the darkness and woke feeling not fear, but kinship. Yuki Tanaka published a paper on geological anomalies in Appalachian cave systems that won her academic recognition and professional ridicule in equal measure. She didn't care. The data was real, even if her explanations were incomplete. She began collecting folklore about guardians and watchers and entities that protected boundaries, cross-referencing stories from Cherokee traditions, European mining legends, and global mythology. She never found Grimshaw's people mentioned by name, but she found patterns, recurring themes across cultures of those who stood watch in the liminal places. She archived everything, created a database, left instructions that if anyone ever came asking about Kentucky caves and ancient seals, they should receive the files, no questions asked. Rosa Martinez designed a new type of ground-penetrating radar specifically calibrated to detect sealed chambers in abandoned mines. Her official reason was safety, preventing new excavations from accidentally breaching old workings. Her private reason, the one she didn't share, was creating an early warning system, a way to know if anyone got too close to places that should remain undisturbed. The technology was adopted by mining companies worldwide. Rosa won awards. And every night she checked the Kentucky scans, looking for changes, finding comfort in the unchanging depth of Shaft 7's sealed endpoint. Old Sam Morrison retired from mining and spent his final years compiling his family's history, tracing the Morrison line back through generations of Appalachian settlers and finding, to his unsurprise, Cherokee ancestry 3 generations before his great-great-grandfather. He wrote everything down: the 1874 incident, the silence that had plagued his ancestor, the dreams of impossible doors and reaching hands. He wrote about the choice his generation had made in the deep place, and he wrote instructions for future Morrisons. If you feel a pull toward Kentucky caves, if you dream of symbols you don't understand, if a small gray figure ever appears in the darkness, don't run. Listen. He died peacefully at 74, exactly 7 years after the renewal of the seventh seal. His last words a phrase in a language his family didn't recognize, but that sounded like a prayer and a promise combined. Grimshaw felt each of them through the binding, their lives playing out like distant music, each joy and sorrow resonating through the threads they'd woven into the seventh seal. He wasn't alone anymore. The weight was shared. When Thomas's daughter Emily graduated college with a degree in environmental conservation, Grimshaw felt the pride echo through the connection and knew that this was what he'd protected: the possibility of futures, the potential for growth, the chance for each generation to build on what came before. When Isaiah prevented a group of teenagers from exploring a collapsed mine entrance, Grimshaw felt the act of protection ripple through the binding and recognized a kindred spirit, another guardian in a different form. When Yuki published her findings and faced skepticism, but persisted anyway, Grimshaw felt the determination flow through the threads and understood that truth-seeking was its own form of courage. When Rosa's radar systems mapped hundreds of abandoned mines and marked them as protected sites, Grimshaw felt the web of safety expanding and knew his was not the only watch being kept. When old Sam died and his descendants found his journals and understood, dimly but genuinely, that their family had a duty and a legacy, Grimshaw felt the binding strengthen, felt it reach forward through time to touch generations not yet born. The loneliness that had defined 900 years of existence didn't disappear entirely. Grimshaw was still bound, still cursed, still the last of his people. But he was no longer the only guardian. The weight he carried was shared by 5 humans who'd chosen duty over comfort, who'd sacrificed pieces of themselves to defend a world that would never know their names. That knowledge, that connection, that companionship, even across the barrier of species and lifespan, was everything. In the deep places beneath Kentucky, in the chamber that should never be disturbed, Grimshaw kept his eternal watch. But now, when the silence grew too heavy, when the weight of centuries pressed too hard, he could feel them through the binding. Thomas working another mine shift and thinking of his daughter, Isaiah walking forest trails and checking cave entrances, Yuki analyzing data and searching for patterns, Rosa designing safeguards and building protection, old Sam's descendants reading his journals and understanding they carried a legacy. And in feeling them, Grimshaw remembered he was not a monster. He was a guardian. The transformation that had taken centuries, that had bent his body and isolated his existence, had never touched the core of what he was, a protector. The humans had seen that, recognized it, honored it by standing beside him rather than fleeing in terror. That gift was greater than the years they'd given to the binding. It was the gift of being seen as he truly was and accepted rather than feared. Thomas Blackwell, 57 years old now and working a desk job at a smaller, safer mining company, occasionally woke from dreams he couldn't quite remember, but that left him feeling purposeful and connected to something vast and important. He'd given 13 years to the seventh seal, though he couldn't recall the exact count, and the memories of that day in the deep were pleasantly vague, like a photograph left too long in sunlight. But he knew, bone deep, that he'd made a choice that mattered, that he'd stood against darkness even if he could no longer clearly visualize what that darkness was. His daughter, Emily, 27 now and working for the EPA, sometimes asked him why he seemed so calm, so unburdened compared to other men his age, who carried their careers like crosses. He never had a good answer except, "I learned what's worth protecting, and it's not the things you can hold in your hands." The 7 of them never gathered again after that day, never needed to. The binding connected them in ways that transcended physical proximity. But they thought of each other. Isaiah would see news reports about mining accidents and feel a spike of concern, check his phone, find messages from Rosa and Yuki confirming everyone was safe. Rosa would dream of Thomas's daughter and wake knowing inexplicably that Emily had just defended a crucial environmental policy. Yuki would feel old Sam's death before the news reached her, felt the binding shift and adjust, felt the thread pass from him to his descendants who would carry the knowledge forward. They were a fellowship now, a brotherhood and sisterhood of guardians who'd glimpsed the edge of reality and chosen to defend it. And in the deep places, Grimshaw felt their lives like stars in his darkness, each one a point of light proving he was not alone, that the watch he kept mattered, that the sacrifice he'd made 900 years ago had purpose beyond mere duty. The first hunger still pressed against the seventh seal, patient and eternal and absolutely malevolent, but the seal held. The seal held because 7 beings had chosen to make it hold, had woven their meaning and purpose into its structure, had transformed duty from burden into gift. And every day it held was another day of sunrises and children's laughter and dreams of better futures, another day of the ordinary miracle of existence, another day earned through choice and sacrifice and the simple, profound act of standing guard over the threshold and refusing to let darkness pass. The miners who never spoke again had haunted Kentucky folklore for 150 years, 17 silent men whose trauma had become legend, whose warning had been ignored. But now, in 2023, there were 5 miners who spoke constantly, who lived loudly, who went home to families and told stories and built futures, who carried silence inside them. Not the silence of shattered minds, but the silence of sacred knowledge, of understanding too vast for words. They were the antidote to 1874. The proof that humans could face cosmic horror and not break but bend, could sacrifice and not shatter, could know the truth and choose to keep living, keep building, keep protecting. Grimshaw understood now what his people had never taught him. Guardianship wasn't about bearing weight alone, it was about sharing it, about trust, about believing that others, even those completely different from you, could rise to meet darkness when the moment demanded. The 1874 miners had been innocents, unprepared, destroyed by knowledge they never asked for. The 2023 miners had been volunteers, prepared by his warnings, strengthened by their choice. That difference was everything. In the years that followed, Grimshaw occasionally heard footsteps in the upper tunnels, felt vibrations that suggested human activity, felt the pull of curiosity and industry always pushing toward the deep places. But they never breached Shaft 7, never threatened the 7th seal. Rosa's ground-penetrating radar marked it as too dangerous. Isaiah's park rangers turned away explorers. Yuki's research made it academically infamous, a place serious scientists avoided to protect their reputations. Thomas's influence in the mining industry ensured no company got permits for that specific section of Kentucky. The Morrisons' family stories kept locals wary. The protection wasn't just Grimshaw anymore. It was systemic, communal, built into the architecture of human awareness in ways that didn't require belief in cosmic horror, just respect for marked boundaries and trust in those who said, "Danger, do not enter." That was victory. Not the elimination of threat, but the building of defense. Not the destruction of the first hunger, but the maintenance of its prison. Not the end of the watch, but the multiplication of watchers. Deep in the earth, in a chamber lit only by phosphorescent minerals and the steady glow of ancient symbols, Grimshaw sat on a throne of stone he'd carved 9 centuries ago and felt the binding pulse with shared life, with continued commitment, with the combined will of 7 beings saying, "The seal holds, the watch continues, the world endures." He was still a monster by most definitions, inhuman, transformed, cursed to eternal guardianship. But he was also something else now. Part of a community, contributor to a greater purpose, connected to beings who'd chosen to stand beside him rather than flee. The loneliness that had defined his existence had transformed into solitude that felt chosen rather than imposed, into quiet that felt peaceful rather than empty. And when the darkness pressed too close, when 900 years felt too heavy, when the eternity of his curse stretched unbearable before him, Grimshaw closed his eyes and felt them through the binding. Thomas checking on Emily's latest conservation project, Isaiah walking the forest with quiet vigilance, Yuki publishing her research and preserving knowledge, Rosa installing another safety system, the Morrison children reading their grandfather's journals and understanding they carried a legacy. He felt their ordinary, beautiful, precious lives continuing because he stood watch, because they'd helped him stand watch, because the threshold was defended not by one guardian, but by 7, spread across the surface world, but connected in the deep places where it mattered. That was enough. It had to be enough. The first hunger would press against the 7th seal for another 1,000 years, testing for weakness, seeking the smallest crack. It would not find one. The binding was strong. The watch was kept. And in the spaces between human lives and inhuman duty, in the overlap of mortal choice and immortal responsibility, something new had been created. Proof that the boundary between species, between lifespans, between the surface world and the deep, could be crossed not in terror but in alliance. Grimshaw, the grey forest, the last of those who watch the cracks, the monster in the darkness, the eternal guardian, sat in his chamber beneath Kentucky and felt something he hadn't experienced in 900 years. Contentment. The deep places were still dangerous. The first hunger still waited with patience that outlasted mountains. The seals would eventually weaken and need renewal again, perhaps in his lifetime. Perhaps in the lifetime of Thomas's grandchildren or Isaiah's great-great-grandchildren. But for now, in this moment, the world was safe. The threshold was defended. The watch was no longer solitary. And 5 humans lived their lives carrying pieces of cosmic truth they couldn't fully articulate, but that shaped their choices, guided their actions, connected them to something vast and meaningful. The miners who never spoke again had been a tragedy. The miners who spoke of guardianship, who lived lives of purpose, who passed on knowledge through bloodlines and bindings, who stood at the threshold and chose defense over flight, they were a legacy. Grimshaw's legacy. Humanity's legacy. The legacy of a moment in the deep, when 7 beings decided that some burdens were worth bearing, some watches worth keeping, some sacrifices worth making. In the darkness, Grimshaw smiled. It was a terrible expression on his inhuman face, but it was genuine and it was hopeful, and it was enough.